Good evening and welcome to one of our premier events at the Nanovic Institute, the Laura Shannon Prize Lecture and Award Ceremony. This is one of those events that we are just most proud of because it is fulfilled and is going beyond all of our dreams about what we hope to accomplish. I'm Jim McAdams, by the way, and I'm the director of the Nanovic Institute. The prize itself is made possible through the generosity of Laura and Mike Shannon of Houston, Texas, who unfortunately couldn't be with us tonight. Laura is one of the longest-serving members of our advisory board, a really remarkable person with a great intellect and intellectual curiosity. And Mike is a Notre Dame grad and a member of the Graduate School Council. 7 years ago, Laura and Mike had a marvelous idea, and that is, why not create a book prize, a really big book prize that would put the Nanovic Institute on the map. And by this, they meant two things. First of all, modest goal, create the leading European Studies Prize in the United States, if not the world. And more importantly, do so in a way that captures what's distinctive about the Nanovic Institute, which so many of you know and have experienced, and about Notre Dame in general. That is to say, what is distinctive? It is a focus on interdisciplinarity. That's the word people use now. In any case, interdisciplinary approaches to scholarship and intellectual engagement, and in this case, Europe. A focus that is broadly humanistic, that focuses on questions that matter for humanity and that aren't simply the trivial, endless endnotes of professional academics, and also a broad-minded focus on current-day Europe as a product of centuries of development. Current-day Europe as something that has been coming into being for a long, long time, and that needs to be understood that way. Also, current-day Europe that is not simply a single state or people or arbitrary demarcation on a map, but Europe that is an entity, a concept, an idea, a value system that is debated by intelligent people who all have different views on what this thing Europe is, that in the case of Europeans they live in, if they can only all agree on what this thing Europe is. And so therefore, in crafting this award, we came up with the following description, which we use for publishers when they nominate books for this prize. The award will be given for a book that transcends the focus on any one country, state, or people to stimulate new ways of thinking about Europe as a whole. Contemporary European studies include not only works on modern-day Europe, but also any scholarship that is relevant to understanding Europe today. This is kind of a big target, if you think about it, but it's a good target. We simplified it by making the annual award, by dividing the annual award into alternating fields. First, a competition in history, and then second, a competition first a competition in humanities, second, a competition in history and the social sciences. Tonight, we are making the fifth award, and on this occasion, in the category of the humanities. The previous four award winners have brought together people of great distinction, people who work in history, literary theory, political theory, and other fields. They have also covered the gamut from the most talented junior scholars, one of whom, by the way, just won a MacArthur Prize, so we think this will be a new kind of payoff when you get the Laura Shannon Book Prize, and to more senior, well-known scholars. And you never know, because it's a jury award, and it's blind in the sense that we're focused on the quality of the work and not on any single person. The prize has also become very distinguished because of the international juries that we've assembled from Berkeley, Oxford, Harvard, Rome, Yale, Stanford, other places, and of course, Notre Dame. Tonight, we are privileged to have with us a preeminent European historian who is already known to many of you. Jerrold Seigel is the William J. Kenan Professor Emeritus of History at New York University. He has the distinction, the kind of awe-inspiring distinction of having worked broadly and in depth, learnedly and definitively on topics ranging, or on topics in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. And among these many topics have been the Renaissance, Bohemian Paris. He's written a major study of Karl Marx's life. He's written on Marcel Duchamp. He's written on Emile Durkheim. And he's a person, as I have found in reading his masterpiece here, he's a person who combines, in my view, the best qualities of a historian and really any scholar, and that is a meticulous attention to detail and evidence. You know, a real scholar in the old-fashioned sense of sitting in libraries and working incredibly hard, as some of us know about, but also somebody who thinks very broadly about approaches to his field of inquiry and their significance. Tonight, we are making the award for Professor Siegel's latest book, Modernity and Bourgeois Life, Society, Politics, and Culture in England, France, and Germany, published by Cambridge University Press in 2012. Our colleague Peter Holland will be with us soon after he's done teaching his class to pay tribute to the book. But for now, it's my pleasure to introduce to all of you Professor Siegel, who will present his new thinking on A Life Between Cultures in 20th Century France, Louis Massignon's Islamic Catholicism. How is that for a provocative title? Professor Siegel.
Thank you very much, Jim, for that very nice introduction. I want certainly to begin by expressing my gratitude to the selection committee for the Laura Shannon Prize for their generous response to my book, to the Shannon family for their support of the prize, and to the Nanovic Institute for European Studies, and especially to Jim McAdams and Monica Caro for their help in arranging my visit here, and especially to Monica for her extreme kindness and attention to me and my wife, Jane, while we have been at Notre Dame. I hope that nobody will mind that I don't speak about modernity and bourgeois life today. It's a subject that remains very close to my heart, but I did complete my effort to grapple with it more than a couple of years ago. Everybody knows how long it takes for academic books to come out. And I think it makes sense for me to devote my talk today to one of the things I've been working on since. Chief among these has been a series of essays devoted to what I call Lives Between Cultures, which together comprise a book that I look forward to having appear next year in 2015. The project takes up a small group of people who exemplify the condition of living between cultures in a particular way, one that is distinct both from immigrants who move from one cultural environment to another, and also from people who belong to groups that are in some way foreign to the places they inhabit. Thus, I do not deal with such well-known figures as the hyphenated Europeans and Americans, whose numbers have swelled in the 21st century, or with people such as Orthodox Jews, Jewish sects in Brooklyn, their forebears in medieval and modern Europe, or groups in comparable situations. Instead, the subjects of my work are individuals who, without seeking to depart from their cultures of origin or thinking that they could possibly do so, tried at the same time to live in a second one. They are people for whom having an identification with a second culture becomes part of their way of belonging to their first. They therefore sought to carve out a kind of intercultural space where they could develop two identities or persons and self-consciously counterpose them with each other. All the figures I consider are either Europeans with one foot in a non-European culture, or non-Europeans who for some reason were steeped in European ways of living and thinking. They therefore straddle the boundary that has been the most significant source of reflection on cultural difference as it has developed since the 18th century, the boundary between the original European West and other regions of the world. Most are relatively well-known figures, for instance, Richard Burton, the English adventurer, writer, and translator of The 1001 Nights, T.E. Lawrence, forever famous as Lawrence of Arabia, not only, I hope, for David Lean's movie, Chinua Achebe, a pioneer of African literature, along with two less well-known African contemporaries of his, and Orhan Pamuk, the Turkish Nobel Prize novelist. But today, I want to talk about somebody who may be unfamiliar to people who do not share some of his particular intellectual and personal passions, the French Islamicist Louis Massignon. For reasons I think will become apparent in a moment, I believe that he provides an extremely appropriate subject to discuss here at what I have always regarded as the premier Catholic university in the United States. I approach these various figures by way of a theoretical scaffolding that's a bit too extended and complex to try to discuss here. But I can describe one aspect of it, I think, rather concisely, and one that is especially pertinent to Massignon. Individual and diverse, as all these attempts to carve out a space between cultures were, all of them contained intimations of something more radical, namely a liberation from the moral and intellectual boundaries that every culture erects for its members. Seeking to inhabit a second culture requires making use of the capacities we all have for self-reflection that allow us to effect some degree of distance from the culture into which we are born. Even as we stand within the cultures that put their stamp on us, we retain a potential to look at them from the outside. A possible consequence of experiencing this distance is to generate a radical vision of escape from culture altogether. Now, let me make clear, I do not believe that such an escape is possible. Surely it is not. But many people have been drawn to imagine it and to reconfigure their relations to both the particular cultures they inhabit and to culture in general as a result. Among the most remarkable of such radical visions was the one generated by the great philosophical advocate of human secular transcendence, the late 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. And in a way, Nietzsche's spirit looms up as a presence behind all the people I consider. Nietzsche understood cultures to be at once embodiments of the human capacity to give meaning to the world and barriers to the full realization of that capacity. What Nietzsche's Zarathustra called the tablets of good and evil that peoples devise to give shape to their lives and distinguish themselves from others also imprison the will within some particular framework, telling people who they ought to be and what they may think and do. Most ordinary people accept this confinement, but there are others who do not. Nietzsche saw these others as the truly creative people among us, calling them sometimes the strong and sometimes Übermenschen, overmen, people whose creative power explodes every conventional limit, pointing to a different way of being human. Of the figures in my study, only two approach this Nietzschean vision in explicit ways. One is Richard Burton, not unexpectedly, if you know something about him, since he was a rebel in many ways. But the other, it may be surprising to hear, was Massignon. Surprising because, for him, all his thinking was carried out in the language of religious faith and of submission to the divine will. Such submission, however, involved a possible transcendence of all purely human relations and authorities, and it is at this point that obedience becomes a vehicle for radical autonomy, for a kind of Nietzschean superhuman heroism. Who then was Louis Massignon? Although not well known in our time, he was not obscure. A professor at the prestigious Collège de France, he was the author of writings of great interest to students of Islam, especially his remarkable book on the medieval poet and mystic, condemned to death for heresy in the year 922, Hussein ibn Mansur al-Hallaj. Massignon had a certain public presence in France at the time of the Algerian War, when he appeared together with such famous people as Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre as an opponent of the war. He has been the subject of much writing and of one major biography. Still, I think the interest that his career has from the point of view I just suggested has not been appreciated, and I hope you will agree with me that he well deserves being taken out of the shadows. Massignon's mature identity was that of a fervent and exacting Catholic. But at the same time, he considered Islam and Arab culture to be what he called his spiritual home, and he dedicated his life to clarifying and strengthening his inner ties to both ways of being. This does not mean that he thought of Islam as a repository of truth equal to Christianity once his religious direction was established. He never doubted that there was but one saving truth and that the Roman Church was its custodian. But he gave many indications that under modern conditions, something threatened to turn Western Christians away from the essential core of Jesus' message, and that drawing close to Muslim life and thinking offered them a path to recovering it. Moreover, he was convinced that he himself had been granted a special experience of what this recovery involved, and that he had a particular responsibility to cultivate and deepen it in order to share its meaning and implications with others. Central to this conviction was the vivid and never forgotten experience of his conversion, the moment when he exchanged the skeptical and, in his later view, deeply sinful existence he had for some years led in his youth for repentance, obedience, and devotion. The conversion took place in 1908, while he was traveling in the Middle East, in present-day Syria and Iraq, where he had gone to conduct archaeological research. There he developed ties with Arab friends, often living and dressing as they did, keeping apart from Europeans. He made progress in learning Arabic, and he began his study of the condemned and, in his eyes, martyred mystic al-Hallaj. So intense and passionate was his intellectual and personal involvement in Arab life at this juncture that the authors of the only comprehensive biographical study of him remark that a priori it might have been much more natural for him to convert to Islam rather than to Christianity. Although Massignon himself never put it that way, he several times noted how important Islam and Arab culture were to what he regarded as this crucial moment of self-understanding. As he wrote 3 years later to his friend, the writer Paul Claudel, "It is on Arab soil that I have lived most strongly, that I have found the most magnificent occasions to learn that in order to love fully, it is necessary to sacrifice oneself fully. God took this under consideration, and it was in Arabic that I acknowledged him for the first time, under his name of Al-Haq, the truth. It was in Arabic that I made my first prayer." And I apologize now for trying to say in Arabic what Massignon said, since I don't know Arabic. "Allah, Allah, Asad Durfi, God, God, help my weakness." And doubtless it will be in Arabic that it will please him to have me serve him one day. Writing to another friend 2 decades later, he recalled that it was in Arabic that I thought and lived my conversion, and that the profound gratitude he retained toward Islam as a result placed him at the crossroads between the two religions. From this arose a powerful sense that his Christian faith did not separate him from the religion of the prophet, but confirmed and justified his attachment to it, locating what was deepest in his being in a region replete with both. Massignon began his study of Near Eastern subjects while still a lycée student in a kind of partnership with his friend Henri Maspero, a Jew fated to die in Buchenwald, later a great scholar of China, and father of François Maspero, who would later found a well-known publishing house with close ties to the French Communist Party. The two friends were not anti-colonialist at this point. On the contrary, they believed that European expansion brought important benefits to people in other parts of the world, and they displayed an interest in figures such as the English explorer Henry Morton Stanley and the French general Jean-Baptiste Marchand. Like many of his contemporaries, Massignon saw them as heroes, in a way models for the kind of scholar-adventurer he and Maspero wanted to be. He had by then read Nietzsche, and there was a consciously Nietzschean cast to this notion of heroism. What had the deepest influence on his later sense of himself, however, was an experience that befell Massignon on his first trip to the Middle East in 1906, when he was 23. On the voyage across the Mediterranean from Marseille, one of his shipmates was an elegant and charismatic young Spanish aristocrat named Luis de Quadra. Quadra was a wholeheartedly and in some ways openly gay man, and he drew Massignon into a series of homosexual experiences that provided the nucleus of what he later would see, what Massignon would later see, as a deeply sinful and self-destructive life. The abyss from which his conversion would rescue him. Quadra, however, was not only a magnetic and enticing gay man, he was also a convert to Islam. And he was interested in some of the same mystical currents that would later preoccupy Massignon. He seems to have been the first person to suggest to him that he study Hallaj. Quadra was drawn to Islam by certain contrasts he saw between it and Christianity, especially an ability to transcend asceticism and a freedom from obsession with sin. A chief reason he gave for becoming a Muslim was that he thought it would allow him to worship God without contrition and combine religion with sensual pleasures, such as those evoked by Omar Khayyam. Although this sense of what the faith of the prophet meant was not the one that Massignon would later hold, its relevance to his own life at the time and the passion with which Quadra urged it made a deep impression on the young Frenchman. Quadra never relinquished his life as a gay man, and there is some evidence it may have contributed to his suicide in 1921, a topic I really can't go into. Massignon did renounce his, but not without difficulty, apparently having at least one post-conversion experience with an unidentified man in 1913. Even in the part of his life when such things survived chiefly in memory, they left a clear residue in his mind. Toward Quadra, he retained an attitude of intense, but now religiously channeled concern, seeking news about him, worrying at reports of his being ill, praying for his conversion before his death and for his salvation afterwards. Whether in remembrance of this connection or not, he also gave special attention to homosexuals as a group. In 1929, he wrote A Prayer for Sodom, some parts of which suggest an image of gay people as a kind of elite, raising themselves above common existence by refusing to be confined within ordinary natural limits. What animated their search for a satisfaction beyond what nature prescribed was a desire for heaven without the desire for God. There was thus a kind of heroism hidden under their apparent debasement. Over the years, Massignon seems to have abandoned his notion of homosexuals as an elite, but not his interest in them. He expressed it particularly after he became ordained as a Melkite priest, a denomination loyal to Rome, but that did not and does not require clerical celibacy, and whose liturgy is in Arabic. From 1943, he dedicated himself to saying a monthly mass for gay people as a group, a practice he had to conduct quietly and in private, in line with what he described as praying and suffering for them in silence and without their knowledge. There seems no doubt that the conversion experience Massignon underwent in 1908 drew some of its dramatic quality from the deep well of complex and tangled feelings sounded by his relations to Luis de Quadra, both in his own memory of it and in the description given by others at the time. The conversion was a moment that shook him to his very core. Images of sexuality and death were prominent in his memory of it, each involving at once fear and desire. The chain of events seems to have been set off during a trip into the desert when he was arrested by Ottoman authorities under suspicion of being a spy. This is not so surprising because members of archaeological expeditions in the years just before the war often sent back information to their home countries in order to let their foreign ministries keep up on what their potential rivals were up to. Massignon was not imprisoned, however. He was allowed to travel back to Baghdad under surveillance on a Turkish river steamer. He made the voyage in a state of high nervous agitation and made what seems to have been a kind of half-hearted attempt at suicide. It was in this state that he underwent the shattering experience he later described as the visitation of the stranger. Although much about this event remains mysterious, Massignon saw it as the moment of his transformation at the hands of a nameless divine presence. It affected him like a burning at the center of my heart and issued in a discarding of all my ideas. He was convinced that God, by letting him fall into the wilderness and then acting to draw him forth out of it, had provided him with a palpable demonstration that even the most debased sinners could be saved. But it was precisely in the depths of sin that he experienced an identification with God. His later account of his relations to the divine stranger drew on lines from the famous Sufi poet Rumi, one of which asked, "Of the two of us, which is the lover?" But he emerged with a sense of restored identity, causing him to cry out several times, "I am Louis Massignon," and it sent him back to Paris to resume his life. That life would be one in which his ties to the Arab-Muslim world would be, if anything, strengthened by the manner of the conversion that drew him away from it, a paradox signaled at the time by his spontaneous use of Arabic to address his first prayer to the Christian God. Although he became in many ways an established figure in Paris, marrying, having children, making a highly successful career, he always retained a powerful and enduring sense of unworthiness. Beneath an apparently staid surface, powerful passions seethed, and he often seemed on the verge of some kind of eruption or explosion. At one point, he asked his friend Claudel not to worry about his ill-considered confidences in regard to my inner shame about myself. Feeling his fundamental nothingness, he said, was both inescapable and essential to him. This state of mind persisted to the end, finding expression in recurring instances of worry that he was guilty of exploiting Islam for his own advancement. Various people who knew him in Paris recalled that his conversation was often full of intimate revelations, and his lectures were often punctured by similar moments. This sense of unworthiness provided one of his ties to Hallaj, a link he expressed by way of the black suit and black tie he regularly wore to go about Paris. In one essay, he noted that Hallaj, too, had always dressed in black, regarding it as the dress fitting to those whose works are rejected. Following Hallaj's example, therefore, was at once a subtle, dramatic, and unannounced way of marking his habitation of both cultures. At this point, I need to shift from the focus I've maintained so far largely on Massignon's life and to one involved with the way he understood it, and especially the way he understood his abiding connection to Islam. In this understanding, the notions of humility, rejection, and debasement were always central and provided the common ground between Islam and Christianity on which he tried to locate himself. Massignon often referred to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as the three Abrahamic religions, all descended from the Hebrew patriarch's faith in a single God and his willingness to sacrifice himself in the person of his son Isaac for the sake of divine obedience. But each faith bore distinct and defining characteristics. And among them, Islam exhibited a special closeness to the experiences of exclusion and abandonment. This association took two forms, distant from each other in time and yet intimately connected. The first was biblical, focusing on the Muslim identification with Ishmael, the rejected son of Abraham, left to wander in the desert with his mother, the slave woman Hagar, and thought by Muslims to have been the forefather of Arabs and an ancestor of Muhammad. The second was modern, highlighting the contrast between the advanced civilization of Europe, advanced in quotation marks, and the less evolved and weaker eastern regions that had come under some form of colonial domination. It was the complicity of French Catholics in colonialism that weakened the church's commitment to the weak and excluded, and which, drawing closer to Islam, offered a way to combat. Massignon's most direct and concise statement about Islam in this regard came in a late essay about Charles de Foucauld. That's Foucauld spelled F-O-U-C-A-U-L-D. He was not spelled the same and no relation to the philosopher Michel. Charles de Foucauld was a famous hermit priest, later beatified by the church, whose life in North Africa Massignon considered trying to share for a period before he chose marriage instead. Foucauld later died at the hands of some of the Tuareg tribespeople among whom he lived in the Moroccan desert. Recounting what the martyred priest's life had taught him, Massignon later identified his lesson as having provided an experiential initiation into understanding the human condition by devoting and sacrificing his life to the most abandoned of human beings. And this is a rather long quote, but I think needs to be read. For my personal experience made me feel that the most abandoned of people in the most symbolically metaphysical sense are the Muslims. These mysterious people excluded from the divine preference in history through the sons of Abraham and driven into the desert with Ishmael and Hagar. I felt that their temporary exile was the prefiguration of the penitential life of hermits, of solitaries who would sanctify all the generations, fulfilling for them the sacrifice of the Qurban, obtaining by their brotherly compassion the coming of mercy. Now, Qurban is an Arabic term meaning an animal sacrifice, but the Hebrew word is nearly the same. So that Massignon was here comparing the exile of Ishmael and the solitary life of hermits it prefigured to the substitute sacrifices at the center of both Judaism and Christianity, that is, Abraham's offering of his son Isaac and Jesus' offering himself on the cross in place of sinful humanity. Foucault's profound and fatal closeness to the most abandoned of human beings provided a model for Massignon's devotion to Islam. My life, he declared, has been given fraternally for over 50 years to the whole mass of Muslim faithful for whom he died, and by one part of which his life was taken violently. Thus, Massignon's own life as a scholar became a kind of after-image of the hermit priests, each testifying in its way that the Christian path to salvation had to pass through identification with those who seemed most excluded and abandoned, even those who bore some guilt for the death of martyrs. Closely tied to this sense of what Islam might mean for modern Christianity were some ideas Massignon developed about what distinguished Islamic culture from typical Western ways of thinking and feeling. Two related instances of this concerned the two cultures of making first gardens and then churches and mosques. In Western gardens, beginning with the Romans and continuing through the Medici in Florence and Louis XIV, the intent is to control the world from a central point of view with long perspective lines leading to the horizon and great water basins reflecting the distances, all framed by relentlessly pruned trees, leading the eye little by little to a sense of conquest over the whole surrounding land. By contrast, the Muslim garden's first and foremost idea is to be enclosed and isolated from the outside world. Instead of having its focus of attention on the periphery, it is placed in the center, where thought can unfold in an atmosphere of relaxation. In a similar way, mosques were more spare constructions than churches, devoid of the elaborate invocations of saints and martyrs depicted in windows, frescoes, or paintings. As a result, the attention of worshipers in a mosque was drawn to the one point that marks the direction of Mecca, the place of the propitiatory sacrifice to the God of Abraham, the Qibla. Behind these contrasts, there lay a deeper one, distinguishing Islam from both its sister religions, Judaism and Christianity. Each of the two older faiths rested on a belief in some concrete embodiment of the divine will within the world. For the Jews, the chosen people of Israel and its history. And for Christians, the incarnate man-God, Christ. Such material mediation was absent in Islam. Muhammad was a prophet, not a redeemer. He was venerated, to be sure, but he had no saving power. And just for that reason, it was the Quran as text that served as the focal point of religious practice, occupying the place in the history in Islam that the history of Israel or the person of Jesus possessed in the other two creeds. If Christianity consists fundamentally of the acceptance and imitation of Christ before acceptance of the Bible, Islam, by contrast, consists of acceptance of the Quran before imitation of the Prophet. The Quran is the only intermediary one can invoke with God in order to know his will. The Muslim faithful were an ummah, a community of believers to whom God had sent a messenger, but the God revealed to them did not act through historical events, remaining wholly transcendent and leaving the faithful with a deep yearning to bridge the distance, as Ishmael yearned for recognition from his father Abraham. This contrast found expression in the different architecture of churches and mosques I mentioned a moment ago, but it also manifested itself in something of more import to Massignon, namely the different species of mysticism characteristic of the two traditions. Mystical experience usually takes off from contemplation of some sacred object, person, or moment, from which it rises to the sense of immediate unity with divine presence. In Christianity, these objects and moments were manifold and often historical. The incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection of Jesus, and the lives of the saints that followed in their wake. But the Islamic insistence on the absolute transcendence of God meant that Islamic mysticism, more than any other, is the mysticism of transcendence, and moves to God alone, God the first served. Muslim devotion required a spare and restrained style, in accord with which those who sought a mystical path had to maintain the strictest simplicity, concentrating their efforts on a single rule, a single vow, a single guide, a single work of mercy. For Christians, on the other hand, both the main features of that union with God realized by the Messiah of Israel and the later sacred history that provided a rich panoply of saintly images and models generated an expression of rules, of vows, of guides, intercessors, and works of zeal that expanded, any one of which could serve as a point of departure for meditation. Massignon did not view this contrast as absolute, and he noted that all forms of mysticism resemble each other at the point where the sense of unity with the divine presence is obtained, but the differences remained all the same. On one occasion, he described himself and other Westerners who attended a discussion of Islamic religion and philosophy in 1954 as feeling, in the communications made at the conference, the force of the Muslim affirmation of the divine transcendence, of the God of Abraham, which releases without intending to, let me read that again. The affirmation of the divine transcendence of the God of Abraham, which releases without intending to, in the Christian listener, a deep impression of mystical desire without images, emptying him of the distressing luxury of sensible imagery with which Christian mysticism is weighted down in our European culture. Now, these special aspects of Islam and the mysticism that went with it were visible in the career and writings of Hallaj. And in turning now to some of the details in Massignon's fascination with him, we will be led to the way that the Frenchman's simultaneous devotion to the two cultures of Christianity and Islam drew him toward the Nietzschean vision of heroic transcendence of culture itself. The first of these features was Halage's understanding that mysticism both attached those who practiced it more intensely to the religious life they sought to practice and threatened to dissolve their ties to it. Because mystical union at its height is essentially the same, regardless of its starting point, it poses dangers to particular models of religious belief and practice, threatening to devalue their distinct contents and rituals. It was partly this danger that led to Halage's conviction for heresy and his execution in 922. And Massignon made clear that Halage was aware of this side of mystical experience. As Massignon wrote in one essay, Halage understood that our desire for God must mentally destroy our image of the temple in order to find him who established it, and destroy the temple of our body so as to connect with the one who came to speak to men. Just because he knew that mysticism bore a deeply antinomian potential, Halage was scrupulous in obeying all the injunctions of Islamic practice, obedient to his faith in the way Massignon always sought to be obedient to Rome. But even so, Halage found himself endangered by his own ecstatic flights. "O Muslims," he wrote at one point, "save me from God. He does not bring me back to myself, nor does he give me back my soul." Although these features of Halage's religious experience were part of what made him suspect to more conventional Muslims, they were an important dimension of what drew Massignon to him, because they led Halage to seek answers to his dilemmas in other religions, and notably in Christianity. Halage knew and cited Christian texts, as of course many Muslims did, since it was one of Muhammad's sources. And Massignon, for a time, in the years just after his own conversion, believed that his subject had died implicitly and perhaps explicitly as a Catholic Christian, uniting the experience of self-sacrifice with belief in the sacrifice of the Word made flesh, the man God. Moreover, there were features of his end that Massignon saw as signaling his closeness to Christianity. Like Christ, Halage was a martyr and crucified by people who failed to recognize who he really was. Massignon was deeply struck from the start by this, declaring, in addition, that 1,000 details testified to the likeness that his end bore to Christ's. Halage predicted his own death, spoke of himself as the truth, suffered flagellation, and cried out in words that echoed Jesus' last words, "Ilahin, Eli, my God." Massignon later concluded that this view of Halage as a kind of secret Christian could not be supported by the available evidence, but he continued to see in the mystic's life and death a kind of Muslim replay of Christ's sacrifice, a pure offering of himself by an innocent creature who takes our place. Moreover, as time went on, Massignon came to emphasize another commonality between the two cases, namely that in both, the initial rejection by the community to which the martyrs belonged had been followed by their reintegration. Having first been cast out, Halage, like Jesus, became a symbol around which his followers rallied to provide not just a new focus of faith, but a reconstructed form of moral and spiritual life. The truth of this in Jesus' case was evident in the history of the church. But for Muslims, few Muslims saw Halage's history in this same way, so that Massignon had to bear witness to it himself. This he did in his book, assembling evidence to show that the excommunicated saint survived in memory and came to be reintegrated into the Islamic community on earth by chains of witness who testified in word and deed to their exemplary role in their common life. The torrent of signs, dreams, and apparitions observed at the time of Hallaj's death gives the impression that the working of the Muslims' collective imagination had come to rest on his person, providing a recognition of the interdependence of the destinies of other Muslims with his own. It was on this basis that Massignon presented Hallaj as playing a role in Islam analogous to the one Jesus filled in Christianity. This, however, was only the beginning of the significance the Frenchman found in his subject. The two reintegrated martyrs provided examples not just of sainthood and its common fate, but of something he theorized as a crucial element in the history of every human community. This was the capacity such figures bore to extract the meaning of the common ordeal that constitutes every group's history. Although in principle, one might approach the history of any human group by starting from the wide variety of individual experiences that can be found within it, these do not add up to a coherent sense of what gives meaning and direction to each shared form of life. Such a sense arises only from the relationship a group affects with the exemplary figures who serve as its symbolic center. These provide what more ordinary people cannot, namely, a resolution of the personal and moral dilemmas that confront all who inhabit a given time and place, but which lesser people do not possess the resources to surmount. It is precisely in overcoming these dilemmas that the lives of saints provide exemplary patterns of living and dying that give meaning and direction to others, forming an otherwise disparate group into a coherent and integrated moral and cultural community. From whence comes the strength to do this? Massignon's answer had three parts. First, no one acquires such strength without divine aid. After all, these are saints, and their qualities depend on strictly personal godsends, gifts that flow to them alone. But receiving such grace depends on a special kind of personal force that marks particular individual natures, allowing them to arrive at an exceptional level of self-awareness. This they do by way of what Massignon called a prise de conscience, a personal stock-taking effected by a heroic act, usually once in a lifetime. This act gives then unity and direction to their being. What this strength most decidedly does not depend on, however, is the stock of common notions contained in a group's existing set of cultural materials, the visions and ideas through which a society deceives itself by believing it can formulate for itself in such things a representation that explains its past and preforms its future. In other words, in order to provide their community with the exemplary meaning that gives it moral and cultural coherence, the saints must first achieve independence from the culture around them, from the moral equivocations and confusions that mark its everyday way of living. It is at this point that I think we can begin to see that this deeply religious vision of what constitutes human history owes much of its basic inspiration to a highly secular source, namely the program of moral and intellectual education Nietzsche set out in his early essay, Schopenhauer as Educator, one of the three essays called Thoughts Out of Season that he published in 1874. The evidence for this conclusion lies in the similarities between the texts and their ideas and some of you may not be wholly convinced by them. But to me, the parallels are too close to be merely accidental. In his essay, Nietzsche put forward a program of cultivation and personal development centered on the imitation of what he called great redemptive men, heroic individuals who rejected any form of earthly happiness, sacrificing their own desires to the noblest ends, above all, those of justice and compassion. Schopenhauer himself, at this point Nietzsche's philosophic hero, exemplified this condition, displaying a higher self that was able to bear the pain of worldly frustrations and enact a solution to the universal human dilemmas that others could only bewail. It was a vision that drew on religious and even mystical elements, as Nietzsche acknowledged, by calling those who fit his model philosophical saints. Such individuals had appeared at unpredictable moments in human history, and for this reason, people in search of a higher life had to seek their exemplars not in figures who stood close to them in space and time, but rather in those apparently scattered and chance existences which favorable conditions have here and there produced. To be sure, Massignon's vision of great redemptive men diverged from Nietzsche's at many points. Above all, that divine power was crucial in the first, but had nothing to do with the second, and that Massignon's understanding of human finality was directed by toward the unification of humanity within the already known parameters of revelation, while Nietzsche's projected a future not yet visible, but somehow to be fashioned on earth by a race of heroic overmen. Yet the similarities were no less significant, beginning with the way that the members of each group silently spoke to each other and to humanity across time and space. In regard to those geographically or temporally close to themselves, Nietzsche's formula fit both very well. People had to act with the courage to declare one's independence from others, with their unexamined values and expectations. It was by virtue of this courage that Hallage, like Jesus, met the martyrdom through which both became the symbolic exemplars around which their followers constructed a new form of moral and spiritual life. To be sure, Massignon does not mention Nietzsche when he formulates this theory of history. The greatest of modern philosophical atheists could hardly make an appearance in so ardently religious a scenario. But we know Massignon read Nietzsche as a young man, and that he saw the heroic individuals he admired in a Nietzschean light. He mentioned Nietzsche in other contexts too. In one exchange with the avant-garde intellectuals Michel Leiris and Georges Bataille, both like Massignon fascinated by mystical states, he referred to sexual ecstasy as a kind of foreshadowing of mystical union with God, akin to the spiritual death that was a precondition for the rebirth that some individuals, that drew some individuals toward union with divinity. And he noted that Leiris's and Bataille's predecessor, Nietzsche, pointed toward this when he spoke of the death of God. Here Massignon was echoing his own experience of what he called the visitation of the stranger, a moment of spiritual death and rebirth in which sexuality and escape from its power were somehow fused. Moreover, as the words I quoted earlier from the prayer for Sodom attest, he remained sympathetic to those whose spiritual aspirations might take a purely secular form, evincing a desire for heaven without a desire for God. Deeply conventional as he sought to make his existence appear, married, dressed in a sober black tie and suit, professor at the Collège de France, and however much he sought to insist on his strict obedience to the church, the urge that led him to seek out a space between cultures was kin to the Nietzschean impulse to transcend culture itself, just as mysticism does, to connect with the deep springs of human creativity that cultures at once release and impede. In our own historical moment, when the relations between Western culture and Islam are questions of great moment, I think Massignon's attempt to draw the two forms of life together in his own person has a certain relevance. It was no kind of indifference to either way of being that led Massignon to draw on Nietzsche's attempt to transcend culture as a model for the vision of human history he developed in his book on Halaj. On the contrary, his career and thinking suggest that deepening our involvement in the cultures that form and nurture us can be compatible with recognizing the importance of being able to put them at a certain distance, to stand in some way outside them, and to acknowledge that values and practices we find in other ways of life may make up for the defects in our own. Surely that is a better formula for relating ourselves to the demands cultures make on us, to the essential nurture they offer, and to the intellectual and moral limits they impose, than the unthinking identification with a single one with which too many of us remain content. Thank you.
We now have, I see that colleague Holland is here. We now have time for a few questions before we present the prize. And as is our custom, we always start with students. Are there students who would like to engage this terrific lecture?
Could we ask that you wait for a microphone to ask your question so that it gets recorded? Thank you.
Are there students who like microphones? This is your opportunity.
I want to hear their voices amplified.
Okay. What? Yes.
Well, thank you so much I thought that was a very good come to know about Massignon. My question is, are you also aware of some modern assessment on his model of intercultural, especially those advocates of interreligious dialogue?
Modern assessments of, could you say it again?
Oh, are there modern assessment on his model of intercultural, especially those advocates of interreligious dialogue? Are they are they adopting on some of Massignon's kind of methodology, or am I making sense?
Well, there were, in the period just after World War II, quite a number of movements for intercultural and interreligious dialogue. And, they were at the root of what we now know as contemporary religious ecumenicism. And Massignon was involved with some of them. But I think that he himself was never completely at home in these movements, because most of them, how shall I say, were carried out at a lower intellectual and personal temperature than the one at which he lived. And I think that his was a kind of involvement in both religions that was so deeply intense that this idea of sort of having ecumenical discussions never really worked so well for him. But all the same, he remains as a figure in those discussions. Maybe I should say, in answer to your question, something I didn't have time to try to develop in the lecture, which is that these Massignon's views about Islam were, of course, highly personal views. I mean, I think most views that are involved with cultural interpretation are highly personal. And when his book came out, a lot of people didn't agree with it. and and disliked, first of all, the emphasis on Islam, the emphasis on mysticism in Islam itself. There were people who believed that that Massignon's presentation of Hallaj, especially as somebody who had a kind of interest in Christian texts, gave to Islam more of the emphasis on pure individual salvation that Christianity has than is right to give to Islam, which they saw as a more communal kind of practice. And there were also people who believed that by emphasizing Hallaj's mysticism, Massignon was actually trying to draw people's attention away from other more central features of Islam. So that's the best I can do in trying to answer your question. In other words, I think that he himself was involved in some of these ecumenical movements, but not with much passion, that his views of Islam are not necessarily ones that everybody would take up in order to effect this kind of connection. To me, it still seems important that he developed them with the kind of passion and intellectual energy that he did, and came up with, I think, very interesting ideas about the differences between the forms of mysticism and of building and culture. And from that point of view, seems to me much worthy of our attention.
Yes.
Thank you for a very enriching talk. And I'm just curious to know whether, and I should know this, but I don't, whether Massignon had any kind of contact with René Guénon. Any kind of? Contact with René Guénon, the French intellectual who converted to Islam and went to live in Egypt. And
I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that question. He was involved with obviously with many French people who were interested in Islam, and I seem to remember an involvement with somebody who converted and went to Egypt. Whether it's the person you're mentioning or not, I'm sorry, I just don't know. I mean, he was involved with, lots of things I wasn't able to talk about, including charitable works in Islamic countries and kind of, mystical societies to draw people together. But did the person you're asking about, did he have were his ideas, do you think, somewhat like Massignon?
I think so, because he wrote about religion and mysticism, and he was a very well-known French intellectual. He wrote Orient et Occident, La crise du monde moderne, books that had a lot of influence and still do today. But apparently André Breton even said if he'd read, or Gide said if he had read him...
The microphone is distorting and I can't...
I'm sorry. André Gide said if he had read Guénon in his youth, he would have become a Muslim himself.
Who said this?
André Gide. So he had an influence on the Surrealists as well. So he was quite a well-known figure, and it might be interesting to look up. I don't know.
Thank you very much.
René Guénon.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Julia was next.
Thank you also for the wonderful lecture. Very interesting. My question is somewhat on behalf of my silent students here, because we have read this semester works of another colleague from the Collège de France who also had pretty outrageous views on things. That would be Jules Michelet. And
I'm sorry?
Do you want me to just talk like this?
Yeah, I think I can't really hear you in the microphone.
Okay.
But you won't be recorded for the... Well, okay.
Anyway, I was saying that we in our class had studied a former or earlier colleague of Massignon's at the Collège de France, and that was Jules Michelet, whose very fiery views. And what made me think of Michelet was the notion of dedicating your life to the abandoned people, because Michelet, as we learned in reading Le Peuple, had dedicated his life to telling the story of the people that no one ever wrote their story down, that is, the working people.
Yes,
and as we know, Michelet's views on behalf of the proletariat were found to be quite unworthy of working at the Collège de France. So my question is, how did his colleagues at the Collège de France take to his somewhat untraditional style of sharing secrets with publics? I would imagine he did that in his teaching at the Collège de France.
Right.
And what did they think of his rather unusual and outlandish views on mysticism and Islam?
Right. Well, first of all, the analogy to Michelet is really interesting because, of course, for Michelet, the idea of sacrifice was also extremely important, and believed that the peuple was, in this way, itself a kind of analog of Christ and sacrificing itself. It's hard to know just what all of Massignon's colleagues at the Collège thought about him while he was giving his lectures. But there are a number of people who mention him in their memoirs. And one of them is a rather famous Islamist who was for a while a Marxist, though later ceased being one, called Maxime Rodinson. And Rodinson in particular talks about how astounded he was at Massignon's conversation, and also believed, I think, that that these personal preoccupations and obsessions did drive him in rather odd directions. I guess I would just say about that how shall I say, people who live in any kind of extreme state, certainly people who are driven to mysticism, they do often have beneath them these kinds of complicated impulses, and they're not unimportant in the history of religion. So it seems to me that somebody like Rodinson, who was much more of a kind of ordinary rationalist than was Massignon, had his own reasons for thinking about Islam in the way he did, too. In other words, we can't think only of Massignon as developing views that were reflections of his rather perhaps odd, certainly unusual personal life. So I guess that's. But there, I mean, Mircea Eliade, for instance, speaks of an evening at Massignon's apartment in which there was a great deal of talk about prostitution and homosexuality, and Eliade just didn't understand where it had all come from, and of course didn't know anything about Massignon's own background, or if he did, never mentioned it.
Well, I'd now like to turn over the podium to our colleague Peter Holland, who is the McMeel Professor of Shakespeare Studies. And Peter was honored to sit on the jury that made this award.
Thank you, and let me first apologize to Professor Siegel and indeed the whole audience for the apparent discourtesy of arriving 7/8 of the way through his lecture, but sometimes teaching gets in the way of pleasure, and my class was delighted to be let out 20 minutes early, but I couldn't really cancel class in order to be here. There is a brilliantly unnerving switch in the middle of Jerrold Seigel's Modernity and Bourgeois life. I had just finished reading the incisive and enjoyable chapter on bourgeois morals from Victorianism to modern sexuality, having rather forgotten by that stage Siegel's outline of what else would fall into his part 2, his exploration of what he dubs calculations and life worlds. I turned the page and found myself confronted with a chapter on Jews as bourgeois and network people. I had moved from Krafft Ebing and Edward Carpenter to Jews and modern capitalism in a single bound. From the changes in morality and the social constructions of sexual behavior to the role of Jews in European history, a phenomenon that Siegel sees as the most, quote, momentous and revealing of all the phenomena that call attention to the relations between modernity, bourgeois life, and the growing importance of extended networks and distant connections, end quote. from intimacy and the changes in the privacy of the bedroom to the connections that are consequent on religious and racial identity. Now, I thought I knew something of this new topic. After all, this is my family's history, albeit from further east than the countries that Siegel is primarily concerned with. I had by this point in the book grown used to the astonishing way in which Siegel, working on such a broad canvas, could find those details that moor the argument in their precision. But here, what could he do here? And then came a little statistical information that shocked me out of my complacent assumption of knowing the story he was starting to tell. In 1816, only 38% of Jews in Hamburg were well enough off to pay taxes. By 1832, the number was 65%, rising to 93.2% in 1848. From 38% to 93.2% in 32 years. What an amazing rapidity of social change for Jews in one German city. And the narrative, refreshed and transformed, and as always throughout this magisterial and exhilarating book, in tight control of his directions and its conjunctions, its large vision and its local detail, moved enjoyably on. Now, the lot of a jury member for a book prize is not always, indeed I might say not usually, a pleasant one. Many of the books one is required to read are hard work. Some are downright disappointing. Few are gripping and enjoyable. Modernity and Bourgeois Life is an extraordinary exception. It was, quite simply, a pleasure to read. And while I agreed with everything my fellow jurors and I produced as our citation of the book, which I'll come back to in a moment, I felt that we didn't do justice to the sheer delight that the book produced in all of us. Here, though, is our citation, the statement from Russell Berman of Stanford, Thomas Elsasser of Amsterdam, Jennifer Hurt of Yale, Alistair McIntyre of Notre Dame, and me, about the so thoroughly deserved winning title for the 2014 Laura Shannon Prize. I quote, "A work of erudite detail and stunning originality, Jerrold Seigel's Modernity and Bourgeois Life offers a magisterial account of the development of networks in terms of economy, politics, and aesthetic culture. In a volume that displays a lifetime of detailed research and reading, impeccably marshalled and prodigiously footnoted, Siegel argues for the emergence of a bourgeois form of life in which networks of means, his phrase, link distant energies and resources in ways that amplify the agency and social power of individuals and groups. He examines the distinctive shapes this bourgeois form of life has taken in England, France, and Germany, building a compelling case that brings apparently distinct factors and even antagonistic forces into focus in an original account of the constitutive features of modernity. Here is a work of scholarly synthesis and narrative power capable of informing many disciplines for decades to come." End quote. What more to say? Well, I found myself last week bumping into an old friend from London who was beginning a project on the cultural history of drama under the title Scenes from Bourgeois Life. And since writing this tribute to Jerrold Seigel's book was on my mind, I mentioned Modernity and Bourgeois Life to him. "I know," he said, "it's on the top of my reading list." Well, how could it not be? It's a pleasure and privilege to say thank you to Jerrold Seigel for writing this magnificent and groundbreaking view of the bourgeois world of England, France, and Germany. Now I look forward to a sequel that stretches the view to the rest of Europe, that looks at Spain and Italy and Norway and Finland and Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, and Russia to extend the brilliant vision that is modernity and bourgeois life. Thank you. You should present.
So if I can invite Jerry Siegel to come up. there are two components to the prize. One is just an envelope. The other is letters. And, if I may, I guess it's kind of wrapped, so just kind of pull it out. Right. If I may present to you the plaque for the award, which we're very proud of. I think it conveys exactly the image that Laura and Mike Shannon wanted to convey. I would say it's quite beautiful. I think it is very beautiful. All of you for coming to this special occasion, for honoring the Shannons, also for being here to listen to this really splendid lecture, a real example of the scholar in action, something that we can all be very proud of. So thank you for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at more events. Thank you.